All right, you guys. I promised, no more than 15 minutes here, but I just wanted to go through some of the information in 3.5 to keep us on track. So if you guys can follow along with the sub and then fill out the key concept notes as you listen here, that'd be awesome. Okay, so today we're going to be diving into the American Revolution. As I had kind of stated before, the College Board doesn't care a whole lot about like strategy and stuff for war. It's not much of a war historian type of course. So we're going to be focusing on the causes, the advantages, the disadvantages of the British and the colonists, and obviously looking at the outcomes of the war. So you guys are obviously already read about the First Continental Congress and put it in your Cauldron of Revolution comics. But here we go. In 1774, so for context, that's what time we're dealing with here. You can see delegates from all states but Georgia met to discuss how to repair the relationship with Great Britain. So the First Continental Congress was not, we're going to declare independence. It was more of like a stepping stone for like, hey, we need to work together. We need to make decisions together on how to work with Great Britain. So you can see kind of some factions that formed amongst the founding fathers that were meeting, and maybe some names that you recognize too. So you have your radicals who wanted the most from Great Britain. They had extreme demands. People like Patrick Henry, who, no taxation without representation. Sam Adams, John Adams, future president of the United States. You have some more moderates, George Washington, who's always kind of taking the moderate step. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. You can also add First Continental Congress to the list of that we have going of like the Albany Plan, Stamp Act Congress, Committees of Correspondence. You can add First Continental Congress to that list of groups of times that colonists were coming together. And then you have your more conservative viewpoints, like John Jay of New York, who later on we'll talk about him as a big foreign policy guy. And then, of course, loyalists weren't represented in this meeting because they're going to be more siding with Britain. So some of the things that the First Continental Congress came up with, 3.1 IIC, is the Suffolk Resolves. Okay, they want to repeal the Intolerable Acts, or what the British would call the Coercive Acts. And until then, colonies would boycott goods and prepare their military to fight. They created the Continental Association. Basically, these committees that were going to work throughout the colonies to ensure that people were following the boycotts that were expected of them in order for Britain to feel the wrath of this, lack of economic activity. And basically, they say, we recognize Parliament's right to regulate commerce. Like, we're still your colonies. But Parliament has to make changes that are going to be positive towards the colonists as well, in things like, creating more representation. So basically they said, okay, in a year's time, we're going to meet and we're going to decide if any of our, grievances have been met. Have you done anything, England, to make things better? Well, in the meantime, we're going to see the first shots of the war, aside from, the Boston Massacre. So King George III, he dismissed the demands of Congress, the First Continental Congress. He declared Massachusetts in a state of rebellion. And we're going to see the first shots at Lexington and Concord. So the first battle of the Revolution, which College Board always likes to know. First battle, turning point, and end. And then obviously we'll talk about a few other battles here and there. So Lexington was the first battle of the Revolution. Paul Revere famously rode out to Lexington and said, the British are coming, the British are coming. The colonial troops were called the Minutemen. And, they were warned that Thomas Gage and the British were on their way to steal colonial supplies, yes. And the Americans were forced to retreat. So they do fight at Concord. This was the first American victory of the war. And it was a shock. It was a shock that They were able to win. There were 250 British casualties. The British were taken aback. This fighting is considered the shot heard around the world, which many of you guys portrayed in your comics. So then we have another key battle. This battle is important because, one, it showed the ferocity of the war, like how the fighting was going to take place. And it also showed that the colonists were not going to be this like easy target that was just going to be swept off their land, and they actually were going to put up a good fight. So it was the first official battle of the war, kind of an American victory. There were casualties on both sides, but they famously said, the colonists, don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes, because this was going to be a lot more hand-to-hand combat than what the British were used to. So the other weird thing about Bunker Hill is it actually took place on something called Breed's Hill, which was the neighbor of Bunker Hill. Technically, the British won. However, as highlighted here, Great Britain has to rethink this notion that this is going to be a quick and easy war, and instead that they're going to have to, really double down in order to defeat the colonists. Now, the Second Continental Congress, as promised, is going to meet in 1775, a year later. Many people from that New England region wanted independence, but we're still going to see, people that are moderate and conservative in their views. A lot of people of the middle colonies were more on the conservative, let's negotiate, let's meet in the middle, let's compromise. And then we have a document, the Declaration of the Causes and Necessities for Taking Up Arms, basically justifying military action. Colonies should provide troops, and those troops are going to be led by George Washington. Maybe you've heard of him. Benedict Arnold is going to raid Quebec and win Canada pretty quickly. And the American Navy and Marine Corps are going to be organized and set up for war. Now, they do try one last-ditch effort in what they call the Olive Branch Petition. Some people wanted to try just one more time. Pledging loyalty, they asked the king to step in, make parliament, give them representation. But of course, King George says no, because he is an extremely stubborn man. He instead passes the Prohibitory Acts of 1775, saying that the colonies are all in rebellion. Parliament forbids all trade and shipping between Great Britain and the colonies, and that is when the colonists are going to declare their independence. Obviously, a Declaration of Independence is sent, written by Thomas Jefferson and his counterparts, The Declaration of Independence dives into those Enlightenment ideas that it is a government's responsibility to protect natural rights of life, liberty, and property, John Locke and the social contract. And if those liberties are not protected, then they can't overthrow the unjust government. Obviously, Thomas Jefferson changes his tone. He says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Declaration of Independence is ratified on July 4th, 1776, of course, our Independence Day. And so this is going to kind of mark the start of actual revolution. As far as strengths and weaknesses go, this is an important slide, 3.1 IIE. So 40% of the 2.6 million people living in the colonies were patriots, but look at that number, 25% were loyalists, still very loyal to Britain, mostly living in the South, and 35% were neutral. In the South, obviously, they have a different type of economy that might be more dependent on British imports and exports of cash crops. So anyways, back over here, the British strengths. Of course, the British are going to be much more experienced. They have more resources. They're richer, and war is costly. They have a greater population in the sense of in Great Britain. Very well-trained army, lots of experience fighting overseas. But, the colonists, they're local. This is a home field advantage. They did not have very many people. 20,000 people fighting at the time. They had a lot less supplies. They were paid very poorly, but the commitment to independence is what put them ahead. We also had other groups fighting, of course, African Americans living in the colonies, a lot of freedmen. 5,000 were fighting as patriots. And then, George Washington, of course, did not initially let them fight, but Great Britain offered them freedom. So the colonists had to make concessions because they weren't going to be able to match up to the fact that if they're fighting for freedom. And the British took advantage of that. And then you, of course, have the Tories. They kept their allegiance to the king or the Loyalists. 60,000 fought and provided supplies to the Loyalists, helped with raids on different, homes throughout the areas of combat. This does split families. Ben Franklin's son was actually a Tory. And they lived, a lot of in port cities such as New York, South Carolina, creating some issues too. And then a lot of Native Americans, of course, supported the British because they hoped that the British would win and, kick the colonists at least out of the western frontier as best they could. Okay, and then we have, of course, how to pay for the war, especially for the colonists. The Second Continental Congress was struggling to provide for a continental army. And they were very reluctant to levy taxes. Of course, that was the main issue of the revolution. So what they did is they borrowed money. They issued bonds, basically a buy now, pay you back later with interest situation. So you could buy a war bond, and then the government would pay you back later the amount that you bought it for and add some interest into that. They also printed money. That's very common during wartime to print a lot of money. It obviously is going to lead to inflation because it's going to devalue the money. However, it does give you momentary relief, excuse me. So the currency was not, worth any money. So it does, become more and more difficult to get people to lend money during this time because taxation was the main issue. By 1780, Washington's army had to confiscate supplies in order to feed and clothe itself. They were a ragtag army, if you will. Some farmers sold goods to the British just so that they could pay with hard money, as you would call it. Eventually, though, Robert Morris financed the revolution almost single-handedly through his contacts in the merchant businesses. And after the Battle of Saratoga, which was the turning point in the war, turning point, the French decided that they would assist the Americans. The Spanish and the Dutch all gave us financial supply, which basically helped us win the war, as well as sending troops. Okay, I'm going to stop there for today. We'll get into the battles tomorrow and the outcomes of the war. But this hopefully kept us somewhat on track, and hopefully you guys were able to fill in some of those key concepts in